Welcome to this week's edition of Book Chat. Today is June the 1st, and here in Canada that marks the beginning of National Indigenous History Month. So I really felt that it was important to choose a book that would get all of us thinking about what we know about Indigenous history and maybe to question some of the things that we think we know. So the book that I am recommending we read today, and there are a couple of things I feel every Canadian should at least once in their lives attend a Remembrance Day service on Parliament Hill, because it will probably change your life. And I feel that every Canadian should make sure that they read this book because it will definitely change the way you're thinking. So the book that I have for you today is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. So for those of you who may not know, the Indian Act is basically the piece of legislation that was put in place to take care of all things to do with Indigenous people. So in 1876, this piece of legislation was put in place, and just to give you a bit of a flavor for it, so how was Indian defined? In the 1876 Indian Act, the term Indian meant any male person of Indian blood reported to belong to a particular band, any child of such a person, any woman who is or was lawfully married to such a person. So that's the definition that lasted for a really long time. It was the 1950s before there were any changes made to that. And I think that we don't often think about the details there. So when I was in university, I wrote a paper about how the Indian Act negatively affected Indigenous women. And I read a lot of reports and read a lot of very academic stuff. This book, though, is in plain language. It's really easy to understand. You don't need a history background. It's well written. It just lays things out so that you can make decisions for yourself about what the impacts of the Indian Act are and what what your thoughts are about it. And like I said, they may change the thoughts that you have right now. So a couple of things that are in this book that are interesting. Some points that you probably have never thought of. So here we go. First of all, the Indian Act forbade Indigenous students from speaking their home language and practicing traditional religion. So imagine you go to a residential school and you don't speak the language that they're speaking there, and you're punished for speaking the language that you do speak. You just can't imagine how that would feel. If you go to a different country and you don't speak the language, imagine how you feel then, and that's something that you're probably doing voluntarily. So imagine this imposition, and you're away from your family, and you're isolated from everything you know, and all of the customs that are special and important to you are also taken away. Second thing, like just the weird things that we don't think about. It prohibited pool hall owners from allowing Indians entrance. So if you were an Indigenous person, you were not allowed to go into a pool hall. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And one of the things that you really need to be aware of, that I think we as Canadians either gloss over or are completely unaware of, is that this document made it so that Indigenous people were not allowed to vote. So women at the time of Confederation were not considered people. Also, Indigenous people were not considered people. Not until 1960 were Indigenous people allowed the right to vote in Canada. So you can imagine I have spent a lot of time thinking about women's rights, and then when you roll in the inequalities of Indigenous people, and then you look at Indigenous women, you put those two things together, it's just something that we really need to think about, because it still impacts our communities today. So like I said, I think we should all read this book. It's accessible, it's a good read, and you'll learn some things that you didn't know for sure, and hopefully it will change the way that you think about some things and the way that you approach things. At a time where we're still witnessing so much racial violence around the world, it is really important for us to make sure that we know what we're talking about. We have history, we have background. That understanding will lead to compassion, which will lead to empathy, and it will lead to us understanding each other. Books like these are important for us to read and to understand, and for our children to read and to understand, so that we understand that we're all people and we go about things with empathy and with understanding and not with blinders on. So I would really recommend that this is a great book to read for June. I hope that you're able to read it, and I would love to hear your thoughts, something that you read in this book that surprised you, something that you were shocked by, because there are lots of shocking things. So have a great day, and we will see you next week.